It's the sort of eye-popping headline that we're all about to get used to over the course of the next several years. The Commander-in-Chief over in the United States of America, or in this case, the President-elect at the time of his statement, wants to do something that would upset the geopolitical order as we know it. In this particular case, repeating an idea that dates back to Donald Trump's first term as US President, the Commander-in-Chief wants to make a purchase. The entire 800,000 square mile island and autonomous territory of Greenland. The island's inhabitants don't seem to be fans of the idea, and nor does the nation of Denmark, which currently claims Greenland as part of its dominion. But according to America's on-again, off-again boss man, this great big island belongs under the protection of Uncle Sam. But today on WarFronts, we're not going to be dragged down into the partisan politics of Washington, and nor are we going to bother projecting how a diplomatic war, a trade war, or even a real war over Greenland would go. Instead, we're going to take this golden opportunity to ask a more important question. Why would anybody be this eager to control what amounts to a frozen wasteland? From the rapidly swelling effects of global climate change to an intensifying war for resources above the Arctic Circle to the real geopolitical effects of a global alignment into a new era of great power competition, this Greenland story is about a whole lot more than just the egos that dominate Washington or Copenhagen. The battle for Greenland is in many ways a window into the battle for Earth's future. So let's get into it. In all the world, there is perhaps no other place like it. A barren, largely frozen island encircled by the Arctic Ocean along its northernmost shores and the North Atlantic everywhere else. Greenland is just one of the few lands left on Earth that still acts as a frontier to humanity. Mostly covered in what is today the only permanent ice sheet outside of Antarctica, Greenland sprawls over 836,000 square miles on nearly 2.2 million square kilometers. It's not as huge as it looks on traditional maps, as those maps are stretched and skewed in a way that sort of misrepresents reality at the world's poles, but it's still 5 times the size of California, nearly as large as Western Europe or India, or almost exactly the same size as Saudi Arabia. Think about how many people live in those places, or how many natural resources are abundant there, and Greenland's sheer emptiness is put into perspective. Not only is it mostly frozen over, but it's home to a population of just 56,000 people, with the vast majority of them clustered into a few towns and settlements towards the island's more habitable southern tip. Since 1814, the island and its people have been spoken for by the nation of Denmark, although they've enjoyed ever-expanding benefits of self-rule since the late 1970s. So, in the final days of 2024, it was likely a surprise to some that America's president-elect would raise the topic of the United States assuming control of the territory. As Donald Trump named his ambassador to Denmark via written statement, he explains that, quote, "For purposes of national security and freedom throughout the world, the United States of America feels that the ownership and control of Greenland is an absolute necessity." He did not offer any further clarification or details regarding that statement at the time. Predictably, the statement generated all the usual reactions in the United States. Full-throated support from many of Trump's more devoted allies, immediate protest and criticism from across the political aisle, and a general feeling of, there he goes again, from much of the American public. Greenland, of course, took some issue with the idea of having itself acquired by another nation, with its elected Prime Minister, Mute Egede, offering, quote, "Greenland is ours. We are not for sale and will never be for sale. We must not lose our long struggle for freedom." Denmark was no less enthused about the prospect, although its defense minister claims that a large increase in its defense spending for Greenland's security, announced just after Trump's statements, had been in the works for some time. But keen watchers of the foreign affairs world, with keen memory to match, will recall that this is not a new ambition for America's 45th and now 47th president. Back in 2019, Trump repeatedly referenced the prospect of an outright purchase of Greenland, explaining that, quote, "Strategically, it's interesting," and claiming that Denmark was, quoting again, "losing a tremendous amount of money on the territory." Back then, the comments led to a rift between America and Denmark, historically very close NATO allies, with Trump cancelling a scheduled trip to the nation as a direct response to the Prime Minister's unwillingness to discuss the Greenland issue. Trump reportedly inquired in 2020 about swapping Greenland for the US territory of Puerto Rico, although that idea ultimately went nowhere. But look further back into the historical record, and the idea of a United States purchase of Greenland is not as new a concept as it might logically seem. It first became an issue all the way back in the 1800s, and again during World War I, when the US and Britain had a minor spat over who would get to launch a bid on the island if Denmark ever chose to sell it off. Britain, by the way, considered buying it and giving it to Canada around that same time. In the 1940s, then-President Harry Truman inquired about a purchase at a price point of $100 million or about $1.6 billion today. Although the United States has never managed to actually acquire the territory, it's established an outsized military presence there, both under the auspices of Cold War strategic competition and in the decades after. Greenland has played host to American military ambition in the form of Project Iceworm, an attempt to build a large network of nuclear missile launch sites under the ice sheet, and it's where the United States maintains the Pituffik Space Base, formerly Tula Air Base, 1,200 kilometers or 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. There, the US operates numerous missile warning, space surveillance, and satellite control elements, and maintains a network of smaller outposts, radar stations, and more. In reality, America's influence over Greenland is already so great that one Danish scholar dismissed his country's own claim to Cold War dominion over the island as a fiction, although Greenland's recent expansion of self-rule has changed that situation somewhat. Historically, the value of Greenland for the United States has been tied to both America's national defense and its Cold War posture against the Soviet Union. Because it's so close to the United States, the idea that a foreign power would establish bases and defensive capabilities on Greenland has been a frightening spectre, while inversely, it's been regarded as a place for the US to fight defensive battles across an uninhabited perimeter without letting foreign attackers onto US soil. During the Cold War, it was about halfway between Washington and Moscow, sitting right in the corridor where intercontinental ballistic missiles would stream over the North Pole in a world-ending exchange. It was a bridge to potentially critical naval and submarine confrontations in the high Arctic, and a place that neither the US or Denmark felt that Copenhagen could defend without some serious help anyhow. But in the 21st century, as we explore Trump and his allies' motivations for proposing a territorial acquisition, the value of Greenland is rapidly evolving. It's still a problem location for rather traditional questions of national defense, with American policymakers and strategists occasionally caught off guard by foreign vessels patrolling unmonitored in Greenland's waters and with critical undersea cables running near the territory. But its true value to the United States is as the center of a whole new sphere of international competition between the US, China, the European Union, Russia, and potentially even others. As we speak, all those nations are laying plans to seize upon new Arctic land as it's revealed from under the ice caps. They also want to build new trade routes crisscrossing the high north and take the lion's share of a part of the world that's been historically neglected. To explain Greenland's place in that new dynamic, we'll quote Walter Burbrick, the founding director of the Arctic Studies Group at America's Naval War College, speaking to Politico about Trump's Greenland statements back in 2019. Whoever holds Greenland will hold the Arctic. It's the most important strategic location in the Arctic, and perhaps the world. Now, the idea that a great global competition in the Arctic would be just on the verge of kicking off is not a new concept in the international affairs world. For the last couple of decades, as global environmental tracking indicates that the globe is heating up, the implications in the Arctic have been clear to see. But in the last few years, the long-told prophecy of an Arctic flashpoint is finally being realized, with NATO expanding northward, China and Russia increasingly collaborating in the high north, and other world nations taking notice of what may be a new opportunity for them. At the core of this new competition is the matter of natural resources, and specifically how an abundance of natural resources in the Arctic has the potential to change the world order that we've all become accustomed to. Every nation on Earth will be richer in some resources and poorer in others. Saudi Arabia, for example, is very rich in oil, but not at all rich in water. Nations like Zambia and Chile have an abundance of copper. The Democratic Republic of the Congo mines most of the world's cobalt, and Australia produces over half the world's lithium. That's just naming a few. Every nation that has a resource that they can make more money off of by using or trading it than they have to spend in order to harvest it will use or export that resource, while nations that need a resource they aren't able to extract or don't want to pay to extract from their territory, well, they'll buy it from a nation that's got some to spare. It's not exactly a groundbreaking explanation of things, but it's where we've got to start today. The place where the Arctic comes in is that the current balance of who's got which resources, who can make up for their shortfalls by relying on their allies, and who's got to buy from or sell to their adversaries has all been basically stable over the last several decades. That state of affairs really hasn't involved the Arctic, where harsh weather conditions, remote locations, and most of all, ice on the seas and covering the land have been too much of a challenge for world nations to overcome. If you want, say, oil, it's a hell of a lot cheaper to buy from the global oil market than it is to set up a drilling operation in extremely adverse Arctic conditions. Now, however, that calculus is changing. Sea ice is thinner and covers the Arctic for less of the year, making it far easier for icebreaker ships to get through. Glaciers and thick sheets of ice are melting, and before too long, they'll leave behind exposed land that can be mined for whatever is underneath. With all that ice of the Arctic beginning to come unstuck, the world's been trying to figure out what lies underneath. And the numbers, as best we understand them, are staggering. According to one report by the US Geological Survey taken back in 2008, the Arctic is estimated to hold up to 90 billion barrels of oil, far more than major oil-producing nations like the United States, and enough to make the Arctic, if it were a nation, the 9th richest source of oil on Earth. That goes alongside 669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, equivalent to the reserves of the global leader Russia, and 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids. Already, millions of barrels of fossil fuels are extracted from the Arctic each day, but that's just a fraction of what is potentially there to exploit. But these fossil fuels aren't even the highest priority for the nation's eye in the Arctic. Instead, it's the minerals race that's taken center stage, especially as it relates to rare earth metals that are absolutely critical for the world's transition to electric vehicles, renewable energies, improved batteries, and more. Alongside rare earth metals, everything from precious items like gold, platinum, and diamonds to nickel, zinc, copper, and other substances that the world just can't go without. In all, the mineral and fossil fuel valuation of untapped Arctic resources could very well run into the tens of trillions of US dollars. Just with that information, it should be clear enough to imagine that control over the Arctic and its resources could make a nation very, very rich. And that is certainly an accurate assessment. Any nation or company that can set up shop in the Arctic and turn a profit doing it will be tapping into resources on a scale they could never do elsewhere. As a result, it's of paramount importance for anyone looking to extract those resources that they gobble up territory, access rights agreements, international cooperative treaties, and all the other geopolitical goodies that will dictate who gets what. But take a look at where these global resources are currently distributed, and the value of the Arctic gets even greater. It is no secret that the world appears to be headed into a new era of global power competition, perhaps even a new Cold War, perhaps something else, but probably a showdown that's got the US, Europe, and places like Japan, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, and most of Latin America on one side, with China, Russia, Iran, and much of Africa and Asia, and a smattering of additional nations on the other. In that sort of competition, control over resources isn't just about making a profit. It's about the ability to amass power, the ability to gain and utilize leverage over one's adversaries and allies, and the ability to progress faster using more and better resources than the other side. China, for example, currently controls about 70% of the global market for rare earth metals, giving Beijing the ability to trade, withhold, or throttle the entire market as they see fit. The top two world reserves of natural gas are located on the mutually friendly nations of Russia and Iran, who together control at least 9 times the natural gas of any other nation except Qatar. Indonesia produces just a hair short of half the world's nickel, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo is so thoroughly exploited by world nations vying for control of the cobalt that only it and Zambia produces, and China produces nearly 5 times more lead than the runner-up Australia. All around the world, nations are constantly engaged in a careful dance to advance their own interests without accidentally forfeiting access to each other's resources, and in a world separated into clear and adversarial factions, resource control is a vital strategic asset for those who have it and a crucial vulnerability for those who do not. But unleash the resources of the Arctic, and that careful ongoing chess match might as well be abandoned. If, say, the United States can come into possession of major reserves of rare earth metals and start exploiting them, then it's no longer vulnerable to what China did in December 2024, banning the export of several rare earth metals to the US and kicking off a major escalation of the nation's battle for technological supremacy. The same, of course, is true in inverse. And across all of the territory north of the Arctic Circle, there is no single stretch more important than Greenland. When the land there eventually emerges from under the ice sheet, it'll be far easier to mine and otherwise exploit than undersea resource deposits will ever be. Operations there can make use of permanent stationary settlements rather than relying on oil rigs or ships passing through dangerous seas. Position military resources there, especially with high numbers of personnel and equipment, and a nation can very quickly assert direct control or threaten military action in other areas. Exert control of its long coast on either side, and a NATO-friendly nation will gain de facto control of the waters between Greenland and Canada to the west, or NATO member Iceland to the east. All of that to say nothing of the value such a nation could gain from stable control of new maritime trade routes opening up as sea ice disappears. And in the event that a nation can establish a large base of operations across Greenland's north coast, they'll be able to maintain a critical bridgehead to expand operations into the northernmost Arctic seas. While each Arctic nation is entitled to resources within 370 kilometers of their shoreline, in keeping with broader UN conventions on maritime law, much of the Arctic's resources are outside those bounds. That means that there's not a clear claimant on those resources in a place where international bodies to decide control of the Arctic are weak and lack the means to enforce competing claims. And it's here that we finally return to President-elect Trump's, or probably President Trump's by the time you see this video, attempts to secure Greenland unilaterally for the United States. Right now, 8 nations claim Arctic territory: Canada, the US, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Russia, and via Greenland, the nation of Denmark. Although those 8 nations have a very clear understanding of who controls what land, it's their attempts to claim and or set up shop on seabeds that will define Arctic competition moving forward. The sole possible exception to that is Greenland, where despite Denmark's territorial claim, everything from Greenland's autonomy to its vast unutilized expanses to the difficulty of patrolling it lead more powerful or more capable nations to believe it's up for grabs. Right now, between proximity, alliances, and military presence, the United States is best positioned to make a play for control. And if it were successful in doing so, it would gain a massive head start in the Arctic competition to come. Now, it's at this point that we're going to move from the why of Greenland's importance to the how. Assuming that Greenland really is so important, how can the US, Denmark, or potentially even other nations figure out what to do about it? Now, before we answer that question, we've got to point out 2 fundamental realities that will govern any attempts to address the situation. Firstly, expansion of resource extraction in and around Greenland will be a process of decades, not years. These are lands that will take a very long time to emerge from under their ice sheet and will emerge little by little, not all at once. And secondly, although we can't say what might happen if Donald Trump sent Copenhagen a $100 billion check, we can say that an outright purchase of Greenland is a very unlikely outcome. The trouble with the idea of straightforward acquisition is in how you value the territory of Greenland itself. Look at it as it is right now, and you've got lands hosting some 50,000 people, a portion that's habitable in a bare-bones sort of way, and a big chunk of land that's an open, inhospitable wasteland. With all respect to the lands, cultures, and inhabitants of the island, all things in life have a price, and the price for such a place might not be intolerably high. But for Denmark, the United States, or anybody else, Greenland is what's called a speculative investment, an asset that may not hold massive value right now, but that is expected to increase substantially in value relatively soon. For that reason, it's difficult to actually put a price tag on Greenland that would make it worth a transaction for both sides. If Denmark does actually give serious consideration to selling Greenland to the United States, which in itself is not a guarantee, then what are they expecting the United States to buy? In essence, Washington would be purchasing the potential of this territory. All of the oil and natural gas reserves, the mineral deposits, the fishing waters, and the other natural assets that the world is pretty sure are under that ice sheet. But the potential value of those resources, as we've mentioned, is extremely high, meaning that Denmark, rationally speaking, would set a price to match. After all, if the US says no, Denmark could just go about harvesting the value of that land through any number of ways. But if Denmark sets a valuation high enough to match the speculative value that is Greenland, then the United States has to eat all of those costs up front, with no guarantee that they'll actually be recouped once extraction begins. Maybe all the estimates are wrong, and Greenland is just a barren wasteland, despite currently being understood as an asset that Denmark could fairly price at $1 trillion if they so desired. That is the situation for Greenland and Denmark, but it's also the situation all across the Arctic, where the nations of the High North are now having to consider just what it means to invest resources into their land, exploit their coastal waters, or potentially try to lay claim to sections of the Arctic seabed. The speculative value of that land, whether above or below the water's surface, is tremendous, but it's very hard to know what's actually under there without poking around, and it's very hard to do any poking around under current conditions where ice is still thick and the Arctic Ocean is still very difficult to permeate. The trouble is, these decisions are being made now, in a process that might favor the overzealous or might punish them ruthlessly based on what they actually manage to extract in the next several decades. In the case of Greenland, the investment of resources you'd need to make to take an actual concrete measurement of what's under that ice sheet would be so high that you might as well invest in a giant space mirror to melt off the ice and just be done with it. Every nation that holds territory in the Arctic or makes a claim to the seabed is only incentivized to let that land change hands if the payment they receive can rival the speculative potential they're sitting on, and transactions of that massive a scale are so unlikely that they're basically unthinkable. So if a straightforward purchase attempt isn't likely to be successful, it begs the question, how then could the United States or Russia or even non-Arctic nations get in on the game in Greenland? After all, the reality at the heart of all of this trouble is that Denmark can't exploit Greenland's natural resources all by itself. It's got neither the funds nor the infrastructure. And it's here that international actors like Donald Trump might actually be driving at. Arrangements to ensure their direct and unmitigated access to places like Greenland, even if Greenland doesn't become theirs outright. Unlike this battle to pry open the icy Arctic, resource extraction agreements are something that the nations of the world are well accustomed to. Major multinational corporations are welcomed into countries all the time when they find surprise reserves of things like oil or natural gas. Nations sign development agreements with each other, with richer and better equipped nations sending their wealth, expertise, and physical materials to nations that can't afford to extract their own resources or don't know how. Major powers like China even set up things like the Belt and Road Initiative, investing in major infrastructure projects across the world that are then used to funnel resources back to China. All the while, the nation that actually possesses these natural resources will stand to gain massively from their transaction. They'll collect money off the top, they'll take and either use or sell a portion of what's extracted, and in many cases, they'll get bonus arrangements like defense pacts, protection, or direct payments for the people in power, and more. Take those same sort of agreements to Greenland, and all of a sudden it's very easy to imagine a world where a technically Danish Greenland is making bank by granting other nations access, while those other nations mine and extract as they please. Of course, this is a difficult thing for a nation like Denmark to consider, giving away control of so many potentially lucrative assets while settling for just a portion of the profits. But what offers like America's offer to take direct control of Greenland could do is to make it much more appealing to consider a world in which Denmark gets a share of the profit versus one where they lose Greenland outright. America shows Denmark its teeth. Denmark has a very long and hard think about whether it wants to be eaten, and then Denmark suddenly finds itself inclined to learn about any compromises that America might offer. Denmark has yet to really start putting those sorts of agreements in writing, and mostly autonomous Greenland has even banned all future oil and gas exploration and uranium extraction as of 2021. But the pressure to take part in agreements and to renege on bans relating to extraction is going to rise for Denmark sooner or later. In that view of things, the United States is still the nation to strike first, but is getting ahead of what may be an inevitability. In a world where Greenland's territory and natural resources pass into America's control, an emerging era of great power competition looks very different. Depending on what the US and its allies find, they may be able to drastically reduce their reliance on current or future adversaries in some areas, while increasing their adversaries' reliance on them in others. And in such a world, a few potentially fascinating outcomes deserve consideration. Greenland has battled with an ambition to declare independence for some time, and while Greenland is deeply reliant on Danish support now for its survival, that wouldn't necessarily be the case if an independent Greenland can scrape profits off the top of large-scale resource extraction on its territory. With that come major questions about the future of Greenland as both a place that could grow very wealthy very quickly and a place that could very easily become beholden to and outright exploited by foreign interests that control its destiny. And a world in which Denmark or a sovereign Greenland open the door for resource extraction from abroad, Arctic competition could very quickly move beyond the dominion of the 8 nations that claim territory north of the Arctic Circle. If the US can maintain and expand a controlling influence over Greenland's territory, then what's to stop US allies and partners from setting up shop? South Korea could fuel its rapidly expanding arms industry with Greenland's critical metals reserves. Saudi Arabia could take its proven expertise in oil harvesting to a new location. The nations of Europe could eliminate energy reliance on Russia for good, while rising powers that are amenable to cooperation with the US, like its major defense partner India or its major non-NATO ally Brazil, could massively boost their fortunes by leveraging what the Arctic can offer. Such a move would invite Arctic participation by non-Arctic nations like China, but nations likely to be allied with Russia by that time will have more than enough work ahead of them extracting resources from the entirety of Russia's own frozen north. All the while, people and hardware pour into Greenland, and the US and its allies grow their military footprints. The resource wealth of northern Scandinavia, northern Canada, and now a fully exploitable Greenland can rival the incredible bounties of Arctic Russia, and the two sides of a starkly divided globe see their balance of resources made even or possibly biased in favor of the US and its allies. If one thing should by now be abundantly clear, it's that all this talk about buying Greenland isn't just another geopolitical whim from the world's most powerful man. Whether a purchase of Greenland is likely or not, and to be clear, our assessment is that it's certainly not, it drives at something far deeper than a simple land grab. On its current course, the 21st century looks as if it'll be defined by two things: a great power competition led by China on one side and America on the other, and a vast series of changes to the Earth's climate and to the world we live in. The place where those two great forces most powerfully intersect is in the Arctic. And when it comes to the Arctic, the empty frozen territory of Greenland is the key to everything. In the coming years and decades, watch that island closely, because we can assure you every major nation on Earth is already paying very close attention.